Well, hello and good evening. Carl Munson here of the Good Morning Portugal show and the Portugal Club, of course, where tonight we're having one of our open-hearted, open-minded discussions beyond the algorithm. The algorithm, and also I challenge you, I invite you to maybe take part in this conversation, hear this conversation beyond your own algorithm as well, because we all have them. There's a lot of talk about the algorithm as though it were a very tangible thing. I'm sure that it's a closely guarded secret, depending on which social media platform of your choice. Choose your poison, as it were. But I think we are as equally prey to personal algorithms as much as they might be inflicted upon us by the social media giants. And tonight's conversation, I'm sure, has been, or the subject matter has been. Certainly subject to algorithmic manipulation in the last little while, and here to talk about not necessarily that, but I'm sure we'll touch on that at some point during the conversation. My title for this evening is Understanding Islam. My guest tonight, Abdul Alim, he suggested Seeing the Other, so I'm going to welcome him onto the stage now and ask him why he came up with that additional part of the title this evening. Good evening to you, Abdul Alim. Thank you so
Good
much for being.
evening. Good evening. Thank you, Carl, for having me.
I thought this was a very useful conversation to be having. You may have heard my preamble there, suggesting that the whole understanding of Islam might have been subject to algorithmic manipulation. But then again, what isn't? But it's safe to say, I think this is a very a push button, a hot button subject. Even if I call it that, I mean, it's not a subject. This is a faith. This is a culture we're talking about, and I'm aware in using such a broad brush as understanding Islam, it's like saying understanding Christianity or any other grand idea, concept, code of being, faith, religion. We can't really do it justice in an hour of conversation, but I don't think that should stop us trying to bring a little bit of light, open our hearts and open our minds on a particular area of our public discourse and connection with each other that I think is fair to say is sometimes a little bit troublesome and difficult for people to relate positively upon.
Indeed, I thought that what you started with was very apt, but I wanted to actually start with a passage that I read. I don't have the author here, so I'm sorry about the copyrights of this. But it starts with saying we find ourselves in a dystopian time that feels threatening to our nervous system. Yet we are here, burning ourselves out through work and drains us of every single ounce of life force energy we have left. In a world that already feels so dystopian, weird, and off, how radical would it be to disconnect, to walk an entirely different path, to turn your back on all that has seemed normal so far, but has brought us out to the burnt out state we are currently in? What you need right now is a radical selection of what your soul needs and doesn't. Radical authenticity and ultimately a radical choice to pave your own way, no matter how scary it might be.
Thank
And
you.
that is indeed what we are looking for, isn't it?
Absolutely, that is a balm to my somewhat frazzled soul at times. Thank you for that. And in the transcript, I'll see if I can match that onto the web and see if we can find an author for that subsequent to our transmission tonight, because it's beautiful thought.
And the suggestion that I had about seeing the other is exactly what sort of dovetails into this, in the sense that it is quite radical to see the other. It is very normal not to see the other.
Yes.
And, you know, Islam is from a different part of the world. It's more of a Middle Eastern origin, although Christianity is also a Middle Eastern origin. Judaism is too, but it has had captured the attention of the Western part of the world for a long time, as opposed to Islam, which came later. And we have talked in our discussions about how the Crusades have sort of shaped the relationship between Muslim people and the Judeo-Christian civilization.
Yes.
Although Spain was a bridging civilization for a while, which nourished both sides of the divide, and yet today we see this polarization that affects our world in everything. It's
Mm.
politics, it's religion, it's just all kinds of views are subject to all kinds of friction and fragmentation. And so it really takes a lot of effort to uh, get out of that rut and say, is there some sort of a coherence? Is there some sort of a congruence in what we are seeing and what we could do about it?
Yes.
So I see in understanding Islam as understanding healing.
Wow. Okay.
Islam is to me a healing science, actually, a healing religion, a healing science of religion, actually. But I say science and religion both because there is so no contradiction between what Islam says, what the Quran says, actually, as what we believe is a holy scripture. So it's the word of God versus the action of God, and the action of God is science, and the word of God is, the scripture, and there cannot be any contradiction between the two, because the moment you find contradiction, you go into this what we call the dystopian thinking about, okay, so why doesn't it make sense? And
Yes.
the more we try to make sense of contradictions, the more we have problems with our current life and the peace that we have inside. To me, my approach to Islam was in search of healing, actually,
Oh,
um,
wonderful.
and I arrived at it for that main reason. And in fact, interestingly enough, I had left Islam at some point in time in my life, because the kind of Islam that I had seen in Pakistan and the mainstream Muslims that you see tends to sort of worry you, actually, to say the least. It just worries you because there is a lot of sort of blame to be shared by many Muslims about how they interpret and see Islam and how they would like to practice it in daily lives.
Yes,
The current debate on burqa in Portugal is a very interesting example of that.
it is.
So lots of people feel very threatened or insecure about what is going on, and
Mm.
and yet I found a version of Islam that I now represent and have joined. It's the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam, and I would like to just take about, let's say, about 10 minutes to try and describe to you in a very quick capsular way why the Islam that I see is healing as opposed to the mainstream Muslim view of the world right now, and where does it sort of goes to me off the track, which is
I'd
why
be,
I leave the mainstream Islam.
I would be very grateful to you to do that, and I'd like to thank you before you get started by positioning it in that way, as a matter of healing, because the go-to, of course, with how this whole Western understanding of Islam has been positioned or conditioned over the last few decades, has made it a political and divisive, polarizing issue. So I'm so delighted that you've gone back to that first principle and addressed immediately the idea of division of science and religion, which of course the Christian West, if you like, had to face with the so-called Enlightenment and rationalization. There was the great challenge, wasn't there? The pushback against religion, in which a baby may have been thrown out with the bathwater, and that's not an unfair choice of words, is it? A special baby was part of,
Yes.
but perhaps the same thing has gone on within the Islamic faith as well. So thank you for that positioning, and please, yeah, go ahead. I'd love to hear this.
Yeah, so I think that I would start with, first of all, addressing a very large concern among followers of all religion, including Muslims, where God is painted as somebody very vindictive and out to get you and constantly checking on you in terms of what are you doing and when can he catch you doing something wrong. And I grew up with that. My father was very religious. And I grew up with a sense of, okay, so somebody is looking behind me constantly and going to catch me as soon as I do something wrong.
Yeah.
And when I started reading some of the literature from the founder of the Ahmadiyya movement, who was born in 1889, who was born in 1835, and founded a movement of reform within Islam in 1889, he talks about that the first step to really look at any religion is to start with how that religion defines or understands God, because God is a central pillar of religious institutions. And I was really surprised to read that he was talking about God more as a maternal force in your life. There is a tradition of the Prophet that says that God loves you more than more than 99 times more than your mother, actually. Which was very encouraging for me to start off, because I
That's a
thought,
good
well,
start.
this
It's a
is
good
my
start.
mother can almost forgive anything,
Yes, yes.
Uh, so, the very first chapter of the Quran talks about four major qualities of God, which is Rahman, Rab, Rahman, Rahim, and Malik. This is the opening chapter, and Rab is a quality which is of somebody, a being that brings you out from nothing, creates you from nothing, and therefore would have the responsibility to nurture you, to love you into something. The first, second is Rahman, which actually springs from the Arabic word Raham, which is directly translated as womb. And so God is sort of is Rahman, who caters to you for all your needs as you're conceived, to start off, provide all the nourishment. Third quality is Rahim, which is when you have reached to a certain level of maturity, he will keep forgiving you for making mistakes. So it is oft returning with mercy. Rahim says oft returning with mercy. And the last one is Malik, which is that he is not a judge, but he is the Lord. And in terms of being a judge, means that judge has to decide things on merit, but a lord or an owner doesn't have to decide on merit. He can dispense with whatever he wants to do, and in this case, says that God has always wanted to be merciful. So his quality of being Lord is being more and more merciful rather than being vindictive.
Mm,
That sort of totally changed my view of how somebody can look at religion, because if you were to resolve the mystery of God in one sense and try and create a personal relationship, which is what this version of Islam allowed me to do, you start looking at religion in a very practical way, so that you have a certain sense of inner acceptance for yourself, for all the mistakes that you have done, and that you could actually go back and try and reform yourself and do better next time.
yeah.
When I think there's an American scholar who says, when you know you do it, when you know better, you do it better. You know, um, so first is the central pillar of God and the relationship with God of human beings. The second one, which was quite interesting for me, which I thought occurs naturally to everyone, was this idea of universal salvation,
Mm,
which is that when you look at religions which are divided into different sects and groups, almost every group will tell you, if you, unless you believe in what I'm saying, it is like almost an industrial project by a certain amount of certain people who call themselves clergy, to sell their version of righteousness and say,
yeah.
unless you subscribe to this, God will not forgive you or will not accept you. And to me, I couldn't ever logically agree with that, because to me that seems that God would then be, in that sense, vindictive, because he would not be able to, you know, treat you as somebody who is great, who has created you, and who is all children of God. So universal salvation is the second interesting concept that I learned from the this reform movement. The third, I think, is one of the most critical ones, which I felt, most odds with, was the idea of secularism, which is that most religions have made a mistake, and I think despite Jesus saying, "Give unto me what is mine, and give unto Caesar what is his," he's talking about taxes, and you know,
Yes.
um, I think the Christian world made a mistake, and they went to try and run state affairs through influence of the church. And I believe that that gave rise to a huge amount of problems within the with this broke apart. This church and state
Yeah.
relationship
Church and
in
state. Yeah.
Christianity,
Mm,
a very bloody, long struggle. And unfortunately, Muslims have almost gone the same way, except that many of the Muslims don't realize that the Prophet actually founded the first modern nation state when he migrated to Medina because of persecution from his birthplace. There is a constitution of Medina that is a secular constitution. It is very well written, and can be found even now in terms of its original text. And the Quran speaks very clearly about the fact that there can be no compulsion in religion. In Arabic, it says, La ikraha fid din. There can be no compulsion in religion. Therefore, as we discussed last time, I think we were talking about this, and I said that therefore Sharia cannot be applied through any state apparatus. That kills the whole idea that Sharia can be implemented in any country or that there can be any Islamic state. There
Yes.
can never be any Islamic state according to the Quran, because Quran totally negates or does not encourage or even allow any mixing of politics with religion or state authority with religion. For Islam, religion is only a matter of total voluntary submission, and therefore it remains in the heart of a person and the relationship between his heart and God, basically. No other third party has any interference or influence on that private relationship. So Muslim countries have made a huge mistake in terms of not really understanding that secularism according to Islam is actually a spiritual or a religious value. And if you were to then look at that from that perspective, all states that have tried to combine secular, temporal, or religious authorities together, which is the case in most Muslim countries, have been facing problems in governance, because most politicians in Muslim countries will try and use some sort of interpretation of Islam to justify their political gains.
Yeah.
And that creates fragmentation both in politics and in religion. So secularism, as explained in many verses in the Quran, is a religious value, and that solved a huge problem for me in terms of what I saw happening in Pakistan when I was growing up, because
Mm.
Islam has been used in Pakistan to, sell political gains and political positions in many cases. Um, and I think the last one that I want to bring up is the concept of jihad, which is one of the most misunderstood concepts among many people that I have met. And interestingly enough, the word jihad actually doesn't mean at all any sort of militant struggle. The word jihad in the Quran actually means a fight within yourself to reform yourself, which
Wow.
is perhaps the most difficult thing that you do in life. Actually, you could probably you can not even change yourself, but to think about changing others. So the first concept of the highest concept of jihad is to be able to reform yourself or change yourself. Now, the word jihad is not used, in fact, in the Quran for fighting a defensive battle, which is what is allowed in Islam. And Islam then talks about defensive war as qital, which is fighting in the name of God. But interestingly enough, the verses in the Quran that talks about qital uh, have a very interesting reading. If you read that verse, it talks about the fact that permission is given to believers, not to not to just Muslims and Muslims to fight, to do a defensive fight uh, for those people who have been oppressed and have been turned out of their homes, persecuted, and therefore permission is given to them, because if they do not fight to prevent this, then no mosque, no synagogue, no temple,
Mm.
no church will be left standing.
Yes.
So the Muslims are supposed to actually fight a defensive war to defend all religious institutions. It's not about defending a mosque. It's about defending a church. It's about defending a temple. A synagogue. It doesn't really distinguish between those religious institutions, in fact. So misinterpretation of the word jihad and misunderstanding of even the word qital, which is actually a defensive war to protect the right to religiously worship and the right to freedom of belief.
How
So,
wonderful.
things.
Um, Now, Alim, I have just had an edifying, educational 15 minutes and learnt more in that time that has I found fascinating and pleased me. Incidentally, not that that's it really matters, especially, but compare and contrast to the messaging I have been subject to, if you like, all my life, pretty much. Certainly in the last 20 years, 20 or 30 years, years and years, days, months, weeks, years of a particular kind of portrayal of Islam, which is so far possibly from what you've said that it's like, it's laughable, isn't it? And it's so bizarre that what you've told me in that I could really relate to, and have no reason to disbelieve, and I'm inspired to hear and want to know more. It's so bizarre, isn't it, that should be the case. That would be my 15-minute allowance of something of the truth about Islam compared to these years of like, well, you know what? It's like this, and shouldn't we be, and all this sort of stuff. um,
Indeed, indeed. Yeah.
yes,
The
yes,
joke is that I was asked to come, when I was living in Nepal, I was asked several times to come and talk in universities about Islam.
yes.
And the first thing the professor would invite me was first to go in and allay people's fears about. So I'll have to go, and my first sentence would be, "Please don't worry. There's no bomb under the dice that I'm standing in front of you. Nothing is going to blow up."
That's so reassuring. Thank you for that. And a bit of humour as well. That's often not found in these sorts of conversations. We have
Yes.
before we go further, let's
Yeah.
welcome a few friends who've joined this evening. Pedro, thank you so much for joining us from Wales, in the United Kingdom, as it's called. Boa tarde a todos, salam alaikum, is what Pedro's saying there, and perhaps saying, forgive me the spelling mistake, but we certainly
Alaikum salam. Yes, yes,
yes,
yes.
we certainly get the sentiment, and thank you, Peder, for your greeting tonight. Shabir Ahmed is here as well. Boa tarde. Wa alaikum assalam as well. May peace be upon you. What a beautiful greeting that is, of course, and not one you're unused to hearing. Those of different faiths may not be so familiar with that greeting. This is an interesting comment, Jackie. What's going on in Nigeria is not defending Christians. We'll come back to that. Of course, we must. And these are such important discussions. Thanks, Mel, for being here, understanding and growing. So that's the idea: open-hearted, open-minded discussion beyond the algorithm and our personal algorithms as well, which tend to create our worldview. And funnily enough, this morning I played a clip of Portuguese president, because we'll have a Portugal connection here, of course, because Alim is here in Portugal as I am. But I had the Portuguese presidential hopeful Joana Amaral Dias talking to David Icke of all people, and the point he made, this is at the protest about digital IDs, was this idea of freedom of speech is important because where your information comes from creates your worldview. And case in point tonight, what most of us, I think, unless we have close personal knowledge, upbringing, cultural connection with Islam, don't really know a great deal about it. So I thank you, Mel, for that validation. To me, yes, understanding is so important, and that's why we are here this evening. Which then leads us to Jackie's comment. I don't know if this is. I mean, should we just go for it? The discussion tonight is understanding Islam. Perhaps that would be a discussion of understanding human beings who use a religion to perpetrate disgusting acts upon each other. What's your comment on this, Jackie? I think Alim. I think you know what Jackie's getting at here.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I entirely agree with that. I think that there is no for somebody who loves God and expects God to love him. There are two pillars in Islam that we talk about, which is the simplest version of Islam. It says there are two pillars. One is humanism, and the other is the belief in one God. And the only way you can actually say that you believe in God and have a proof of it is how you treat other humans around you. Because there's no other concrete proof of what your belief is. That's only a matter of heart, basically. Nobody can see that.
Yes.
But they can see how you are behaving with other people. And so if you are cruel to other people, then the God that you believe in, you need to probably find another God, actually,
Bit of
to
advice.
justify what you're doing.
Yeah.
So human service is such an important part of religion. In fact, I would go to the extent where I would say that in Islam, if you are praying, because it talks about rights of God and rights of humans. And in some senses, actually, rights of humans take precedence over rights of God. And I will give you an example of that. The example of that is that if you are praying and you are fulfilling, of course, the duty to God, right to God, and you find somebody next to you who is perhaps under threat by an insect or a snake or something, you are supposed to break your prayer, not continue it, and to save that person from harm,
Mm,
which is that the duty to humanity takes precedence at that time over duty to God. It's never the other way around, which is what what perhaps Jackie is getting at, is that not defending Christians is of course not Islam. You know,
mm, yeah.
and here we are talking about, of course, a lot of what I would say muddled water, which has
Yes.
happened over centuries in terms of Islam being used by empires, by political leaders, by different factions, and fragmentation of thought process, which has led to misinterpretations. Uh, Perhaps even among all religions, I think this happens, and
Like,
I think
sorry to
it's
say that.
this.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but there can't be a single religion that hasn't befallen that same fate to be
Yes,
used
exactly. Yeah.
wrongly in the wrong hands.
And I think my understanding of this is that usually, as religions move away from their source, there is always a split uh, between the ritualists and the esoterics or
Hmm.
the exoterics. And
Yes.
the esoterics would want to do something like the Sufis do, or those people who would want to give up all sort of form and
Yeah.
say we are just following the only the spiritual path, and they
Yeah.
will try to discover different ways to satisfy the urge to give a form to that. On the
Yes.
other hand, you have the ritualists who would then totally not worry about the spirit, and they will think that just doing the rituals would provide them the satisfaction they're looking for.
Yes.
And that's the split that we see in almost all religions.
Yes,
And then
indeed.
the ritualists are taken over by the clerics, because the cleric will give you some sort of a prescription to do this, do that, and do that. And that makes life very easy, although you might turn blind in that process. But the esoterics would try and not give you that. And therefore, in one sense, no accountability, no shape or form, no discipline. And
Mm.
so, human nature wants both of these things, but in a sort of an optimum mix where discipline doesn't really kill you totally,
Yes.
uh, but that it keeps the spirit alive. And, that sort of mixing of these two streams gives the balance of rationality and love. To me, there is always there has been a long clash in civilizations about finding absolute truth and absolute love.
Mm.
People who are more ritualistic are looking for absolute truth, and when you're doing a rational search for absolute truth, you will always fight for it because it's a rational fight. you know
Yes.
and people would want to get physical, and it's like I'm more equal than you.
Yeah.
you know and I think a lot of wars that have been fought over the last 200 years in Europe and elsewhere, mostly perhaps in Europe, is about this fight for who's more equal than the other.
Yes.
In
And
absolute
we lapse very quickly, don't we? In the end justifies the means is a
Yes, exactly.
recurring
Yeah.
motif, isn't it? In our yes, in
And
the
then
youth
that's
religion.
the finding the absolute truth versus, to me, the real issue is, can you find absolute love, which
Yeah.
is what inherently we want, isn't it?
Yes.
That's the healing we
Yes.
need.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Again, it's like first principles. What would be the point otherwise if that
Yes.
were not the aim or the journey? And I suppose as human beings, we like to think of, we want to get to the end rather than perhaps seeing it as a journey, which we really, I mean, if we think about it at all, it must be a journey, mustn't it? The human life itself is a journey, and we're not perfect. So you might think our evolution, our unfoldment as the best we can be is also a journey. But I really like the way you've put that. The journey or the standing for absolute love it wouldn't be a bad intention to have, would it, to govern and rule over your affairs and how you went about life?
And interestingly, you say that because I've always felt that in absolute struggle for absolute truth, and fight for rationality, you quickly get into the idea of inequality, which gets violent.
Yes.
You don't accept inequality in rational thought process because somebody would be superior to you. You know,
Yeah.
but interestingly enough, if you look at the search for absolute love, you can actually you don't probably actually mind having a hierarchy of love because you would inherently discover somebody has more capacity to love than you.
Yeah.
you know and you
Yes.
don't mind that because it's fine. You would want to be among people who can love more than you, isn't it?
It's a win-win. It's a
It's a
win-win. It's
win-win. Yeah,
amazing.
exactly.
And anyone, and I imagine everyone who's ever had an experience that in any way approximates to absolute love would say that's the truth, wouldn't they? That in its own way is absolute truth, rather than
Yes.
an article or some concept or abstraction of the truth, which, as you I think rightly point out, causes a lot of
Yeah,
trouble.
and I think the idea of perfect love goes with perfect beauty. Absolute love goes
Yes,
with
yes,
absolute
yes,
beauty. And human heart uh, cannot be prevented from really getting attracted to that. And
yes,
and to me, the idea of absolute love is also that it will constantly create. Creation is a very, very essential function of love.
yes,
And so that also answers the question, why did God create us? you know,
yes,
because if God is absolute love, then creation springs from that absolute love, no matter what you do.
yes. So all,
And
all that's left.
therefore, yeah, exactly. Therefore, the whole idea of being actually is so tied to the process of the perfection of love and the perfection of creation that comes with it, actually.
Yes. So we might just act like it as well, mightn't we? If
Yes.
that's what we are, indeed. Shabir, thank you very much. We'll come back to that as a kind of later topic, if we may. We'll be here for another half hour or so, so lots of time to talk and unpack things and ask questions. But I think that's a great practical conclusion to tonight's conversation, perhaps. Peder, my father served in the Middle East during World War II. I served there in the 60s. Dad told me that if ever I felt the need to pray, to just remember to remove my shoes, that day came, and I did. Wow, well done, Peder. Yes, that's the big test of any atheist, isn't it? they, they they find themselves in a spot one day, and they're not so atheistic after all. Perhaps that's where you were, Peder, in that situation. I was welcomed, he says, and I got the support I needed. I'll never forget. How beautiful! That's very moving, Peder. Thank you very much for that. I just want to ask you. I suppose is it fair to say you're on a mission? Um, Here you are in Portugal. You've chosen Portugal as your home. You are, as it says, as scrolling on the screen beneath you there, a secretary for external relations. You have work to do here in Portugal, and I think in a global sense as well, of the Ahmadiyya, if I've pronounced that correctly, Ahmadiyya Muslim Association, and you are the Portugal representation of that. Could you say a little bit more about that? Possibly, the work you're doing within the context of how difficult that job must be in a sense. I mean, I get on a personal level, loving God is a beautiful thing, and that would inspire you. And then there is what's going on in the world in which you are expected to be the secretary for external relations. And what a tough job that must be at the moment. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think um, I'd say go back. Let's go back to what we have been discussing, and I think you're an expert at that, and that is to find connections. And it's all a part of the process that I've started with the journey in Islam, which is journey of healing
Mm,
of both yourself and those who you connect with.
yeah,
And I think that my work as a secretary of the association essentially is about connecting and provide that opportunity for people to exchange information. I can tell you, for instance, one of the most contemporary issues that we are talking about nowadays is this burqa ban that has happened in Parliament.
yeah,
And as one of the persons who needs to really engage in this debate, we will definitely do something this Friday. But you know, to use your program to actually articulate what one would think about this issue
Yeah.
would be to ask, okay, so what would be an Ahmadiyya view of this? Because, you know, I've explained two or three things that about secularism, about jihad, and all the others, where you find my views very moderate and,
Yes.
interesting and attractive. And similar is the case with the issue on women and the veil. And this is a very interesting debate that is always asked of Muslim women across the Western world. You know, why is this happening? And are you oppressed? And are you doing it of your own volition? Has somebody really forced you? And things
Yes.
like that. I think that we distinguish between what happened in the West in terms of the feminist struggle, which is that women tried to get their rights back from men who had oppressed them in one sense.
Hmm.
Um, in case of the Ahmadiyya view of Islam, we say that men are not supposed to be giving rights to women anyway. It's God who has given them rights, you know.
Yes.
So they have their inalienable rights given to them by God, which they must exercise as they want them to be exercised, you know. And in terms of belief structures, in terms of spirituality, women or men are totally equal in the eyes of God. You know, there is no one superior to the other because of their gender or because of their sex. To start with that, the second part of this is that when it comes to the exercise of modesty, which is the underlying principle for observation of veil,
Mhm.
um, it applies equally to men and women. So the verse that talks about this in the Quran actually addresses men first and tells them to lower their gaze. So men should not be going around, looking at women in a way which is not acceptable to women.
Mm.
So the first principle of modesty or veil actually is for the eyes of the men
Yes.
who are, going around walking or in gatherings where other women are. And after that, uh, the principle of modesty, where women want to observe that principle of modesty, is the reflection of their relationship with God, not with any men around them. You know, so if a woman is conscious of her uh, godly relationship or her own divinity, and has a sense of self-respect and dignity of her own self, the question of how she would want to observe that modesty would be left to her and her God.
Yes.
You know, and that is a freedom that she has given to her, granted by God, not by men. You know, so depending on that formula or depending on that principle, different women will adopt different kinds of practices to appear to have a relationship with God or to have a spiritual relationship with God.
Hmm.
And in Islamic culture, in fact, even in Christian culture, you see pictures of old Mary with all the scarf and the long dresses, and people still wear these things in Portugal.
Yes, of course.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
and so the degrees of that modesty, of expression of that modesty, would differ with the state of belief that the woman has, in terms of what her relationship with God is. And it's not no business of any state or men or people around in society to tell a woman how to dress.
Yes.
Now, this can be distinguished from the issue of security that perhaps is the I would hope so. At least, there is, of course, all kinds of undertones of
Yes,
other things
indeed.
happening. But I
Yes.
would hope that the government was really serious about the issues of somebody not being able to be identified, or men concealing their face and doing some things which can be dangerous, which is what has happened in parts of the Muslim world. And that is entirely, within the Islamic premise that the state has that right to do that. But the
Yes.
state should not be debating how women dress. They can take a view of security, which is important for all citizens, but to use that as a basis to start legislating, which is now what is happening in many parts of the Western world, where women are being told how to dress or not to dress. Even with secular societies like France, I think that goes too far. And I would expect that the debate here in Portugal remains in terms of principles a moderate debate, where we could remain confined to the essence of it and not give in to the pressures that get states involved in people's personal affairs, because that is against the principle of secularism that has been practiced in Portugal and other parts of the Western world for a long time.
Thank you. Very excellently articulated and analysed there. And yes, the words "in public" were not the ones emphasised, were they, with this legislation? Because that's a key, and you brought that to my attention here. That's, if it's a security matter, that is the key part of this, isn't it? Is in public, and what people choose to do according to their faith and culture, and subject to other parts of the state's law, of course, that people seem to be concerned about. Suddenly, there are a lot of people suddenly concerned about women's rights because of what they think about this issue, when they might not have been before, interestingly. And I noticed the government didn't say, this applies to all face coverings for all women in public, because that could be quite awkward with regard to Catholicism. And
Yes.
as Mel says here, the black clothing you had as well there, Mel. In my town, there are Portuguese widow women, head to toe, stockings, headwear, etc. And there was no way this issue of the burqa being banned in public, as it seems to have been, and I think the president still has to rubber stamp and promulgate that. But it could not be a politicized, emotionally charged issue, sadly, could it? And maybe Portugal's done quite well to do its best to minimize that. But I think, given how cynical politicians can be, they probably got a little bit of cake and were able to eat it too with that particular bit of legislation.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah.
And I think I would just like to use a few minutes of our remaining time on the fact that um, you know we we have been also persecuted for what I'm saying. I
Yeah.
mean, I can say some of these things, and then I would have a lot of people disagreeing with me, and it can actually get dangerous. Uh,
Right.
and so, finding safe spaces to talk about these things is very important. And this is why I really appreciate you coming along and saying, okay, we can open up this space for your discussion, because it's always threatening to say some things like which would appear to be getting you promoted as an infidel among people,
Yes.
because some of these ideas are not really mainstream. It's a if I don't know if you can put the link there, but it's the website is alislam.org, which is all small words, alislam.org, which is you can find where we can find all these interpretations. And the head of the Ahmadiyya movement uh, claimed to be a latter-day reformer,
Right.
uh, and he said that he's here to reinterpret and the scriptures for people to be able to stay believers in this current age and be able to find God. Yes, thank you very much. This is the website that people can go and find more interesting information when they would like to find more information.
Superb. That's
Um,
the website of your organization, alislam.org. Yeah, and thank you for being here, and thank you for saying that. But you see, for me, I don't know what the alternative is. I have become. I was going to say I'm happy to run the risk. I'm not really. I mean, I don't like causing trouble, or finding myself at the receiving end of people's projections and hatred and so on. But I don't know what the alternative is really. I'm prepared to do that for the purposes of us having conversations of this kind. The alternative would be for the situation that we was referring to obliquely, that will just keep compounding, won't it? Without people going into the nuance and the longer grass and taking some time to understand each other, the problems we see will only get worse, I suspect.
Indeed, and I think that one of the very interesting things that I found when I was working in the Philippines was my interaction with an agency, an institution called Moro Liberation Front. Moro Liberation Front, and these are Moors, or they were called Moro because the King Philip from Spain actually went and conquered the Philippines and named it the Philippines.
Of course.
And Muslims are already living there, and they were sort of pushed back and had to leave and go into the south of the country, and they
Right.
were struggling for their rights. And then because these were mainly Spanish people who had ended up in Philippines, they call them Moors, or Moro Liberation Front, basically, to remind them of the Moors here in Spain.
Wow.
Um, and when I talked to these people, they said, well, this is a totally secular liberation struggle, as it should be, because struggle for self-determination is about geography. It's not about religion. you
Yes.
know
Yes. Yes.
and very few people actually try and distinguish between these two. So for instance, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, was totally secular struggle for self-determination for the Palestinians, until in 1987, Hamas came on board, and then, Islam got mixed up with a self-determination struggle.
Yes.
Same thing happened in Philippines, where Moro Liberation Front was then named Moro Islamic Liberation Front. You and similar thing happened in Kashmir, where suddenly the struggle for self-determination of Kashmiris suddenly became jihad. you
Yes.
know, and interestingly enough, the transformation of a totally secular self-determination struggle into to be called an Islamist or Islamic struggle tends to give rise to this whole idea, a whole issue of Islamophobia. Because
Yes.
then people think, okay, so anybody who's fighting, and these are the three hotspots, two hotspots, Kashmir and Palestine. We know these are essentially what determines the headlines today,
Yes.
and the headlines will always be, look, these are the Muslims who are fighting jihad, these are the Muslims doing this terrorist activity and whatever. And the fact is that none of this has to do anything with Islam. It has totally to do with secular liberation struggles, which will happen whether or not it is. It will probably happen in African countries and other countries where people are actually fighting for their identity. you
Yes.
know and that
Yes.
is not necessarily about religion.
No.
And this is why that verse that talked about defending the church and the mosque and the synagogue talked about a religious struggle and the freedom for religious belief. It didn't talk about freedom of a country. It didn't talk about freedom of a geographical entity. It didn't talk about self-determination struggles. It talked about freedom of belief. You know.
Isn't it amazing how the perception or the manipulation of particular narratives, agendas can obscure something so essentially wonderful and beautiful. But Islam is not alone in suffering that. Well, to mix my metaphors, in having that cross to bear. I know that's not the best. That's probably not the best choice of words. However, I think we get the message there. I mean, and I suppose that's life. That is the spiritual struggle itself, isn't it? Is to overcome the carnal and the mortal and the material in favor of something more beautiful. And that is I mean, yeah, to ask you on a question along those lines, do you see that we're in a particular stage in human history or evolution that makes these conversations and that struggle prescient or particular in this time?
Yes, and I'll go back to the passage that I read when we starting off, and I said, when we're talking about a dystopian time,
Yes,
and we are looking for radical solutions to find peace.
yes.
And I have always wondered. I had a Swiss friend come and visit us recently, and he talked to me and he said, you're a weird Muslim.
It's a compliment, right? It's a compliment, a
Yes.
big compliment.
I was wondering, so what does it mean by being weird? And I thought he might have said, okay, so you are very interesting. It's like you're saying things that I have never heard about Islam.
Yeah,
And this is what usually happens. So when I'm talking about this, people sort of, start off, and then their eyes start going wide and wider and wider, and say, okay, well, you've never heard this before. So are you really a Muslim?
you get you get challenged.
I always say, well, I'm the wrong kind of Muslim,
You are.
because
That's right. That's right. You must be
I,
doing something right.
I had to sort of self-exile myself from Pakistan, because they couldn't accept, wrong kinds of Muslims in Pakistan. They only need right kinds of Muslims. So for me, it was almost, for us, it was like almost life threatening then to live in my own country. I was talking to one of my Portuguese friends, and I said, nobody wants to leave their countries. It is only when you cannot really live in your own country that you will have to migrate.
Well,
and and here is then the issue that you were mentioning. where do you find your healing journey take you?
Yes. Well,
And
you started off talking about that. Your move from Pakistan to ultimately to Portugal in quite a light-hearted way, but that is no small matter, is it? That's an incredible upheaval to face, based on your life choices and how you want to be as a man and as a human being. So I'd like to acknowledge that. That must be an extraordinary situation to find yourself in, and here you are doing this work. In representing the organization and the finer points, if I can refer to them, of Islam, as your I suppose in the Christian analogy is in preaching the gospel, isn't it? It's telling it how you see it and how it is, as your work, as your self expression.
indeed, I think it's, to me, the love of God is an experiential reality. It's
Yeah.
not about only rationality. I
Yes.
do think that there is a need for rationality, because you need to actually have the validity of your observation come true, in one sense, that your experience must be repeatable, and you come up with the same conclusions or results as you move along, so that there is some scientific rationality to your belief, because
Yes.
not entirely, you're not running entirely blindly, but there is an internal sense of satisfaction or content that must come with that rationality.
Yes.
And there needs to be, as I always said, a lot of people end up being alone, because they have their own individual religion, you know.
Right.
And it's very important for me to see religion as connections,
Yeah.
as company, as friendship, you know.
And fellowship, I suppose, is a word that comes
As
to mind.
exactly as fellowship,
Yes.
and to be able to share this precious experience that we all have as humans, in terms
Yes.
of what we have learned and how one can actually share that. There is absolutely no intention of saying to to converting anybody. It's about it's about sharing information that can be of use to people,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
about it. Because the Quran says that you cannot ever convert anybody. It's God who does that.
Right,
So
absolutely. Can completely accept and understand that. And on this practical note that Shabir has suggested to us, thank you for being here. What practices or habits can ordinary people adopt to better understand their Muslim neighbours, beyond media narratives? And I'll go back to what I asked you before. This is a tough job, given the odds are against you, aren't they, in many ways? Or there are forces at work that are against you in terms of what people understand, and we tend to just focus on these sort of lazy soundbite conclusions that we've come to without having too much of a dialogue or discussion about this. This would be a great way to build fellowship and connection between people, wouldn't it? These sorts of practices and habits. What would you suggest?
well, for me, one of the important practices is to greet people. you know I smile says a lot. When I walk in here, in my own town, I always try to be I try to be engaged in my walk,
Mm,
to smile at people, to return the smiles, to greet them in Portuguese way. And I think it starts from there.
yeah.
Essentially, that should be a part of the usual habit. But to me, my favorite part is inviting people for lunch or for food. You know,
It's
it
the
is it is food.
Portuguese way. The
Yeah,
Portuguese
the Portuguese way. It is he is eating food together, which which you can actually, you don't have to be defensive if you're eating food. you
right,
know,
right.
and the art of alimentation essentially is about conveying your message in different ways. So food for thought and food for stomach go very well together, in fact.
They do, and I saw I can't remember his name, unfortunately, but I think he's a Lebanese former investor turned philosopher, and he has some very interesting things to say about investing and this and where the world is at the moment. But he did speak. He made special mention of people who or cultures that make a point of people eating, and how that in the times of exploration, how useful that was to build trust, to understand people, was to do that across the table, in a way that perhaps we've over formalized or forgotten in more recent times, or rationalized or whatever. But going through that, It's very human, isn't it? It's very human to be out of your depth and to see how you
Some of
respond.
the most interesting eating experience I've had was in Yemen, where they will actually bring out a huge dish of let's say rice. Rice is piled at the center, and then there are like 10 people sitting around the dish, and everybody is eating from their side, and you can observe who is trying to be.
Yes. Well, who's trying to make some headway into somebody else's
Exactly, yes.
supposed portion of rice?
It's,
That's a
it's a
really
very interesting communal practice of eating,
for
and it
sure.
teaches you a lot about who people are around the table.
Absolutely understand your new friends in that way. And yeah, finally, given this is the Portugal Club, this is where we both are. It's a culture where I think we, generally speaking, feel very welcome. Speaking for myself, anyway. Are you finding Portugal a hospitable and open place with the work that you're doing?
Oh, very much. Yes,
Right.
absolutely. I think Portuguese people are really welcoming, very tolerant, and I think also that there is perhaps still a nostalgia for religion. Um, they are still not too far away from the Catholic practices.
Yes.
And I love to associate with people who are religious. I remember once I was traveling in a plane, and there was a Christian sitting right next to me, and he asked me, and I said, do you go to church? And he said, no, I don't go to church. I said, why don't you make a habit to go to church? And he said, you're the first Muslim who has told me to go to church.
He's never forgotten that, and neither
he
of you.
said, I thought he would say you should convert to Islam. I said, no. I
Yeah,
said, no, you should go to the church.
yeah, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Yeah, that's there is something. There are many great things about what the perfect storm, if you like, of Portuguese culture, which makes it the place it is. That people don't, it's very easy to be superficial about that, but there are some deep things, aren't there, about this country that make it a beautiful and welcoming place to be. And I think that is one of them. The oppression in living memory is another, of course, isn't it? And the religious tradition, and yeah, this great sense of family. It's these are, I suppose, these are the values that precede religion. They are the things that religion is trying to bring us back to, that may already exist here in this country.
I tell you, nothing pains me more than seeing there's churches around, walking around, to see
Yes.
them empty and vacant,
Yeah.
or in disrepair. It really
Yes.
pains me because one would want to have them to be populated and vibrant, and people coming together. It's about connections, and I think everything has been affected when you lose connections. You lose
Yes.
connection in everything, not
Yes.
just the church. In fact, yeah.
Alim, thank you so much. That is an hour. It's been a great. I think we've done our mission justice tonight with an open-hearted, open-minded discussion beyond the algorithm. We don't get the last word on the algorithm. We may have been suppressed or manipulated in that process. We'll see what happens with that. And love the greetings earlier on that we were offered by. Yeah, may peace be upon you from Shabir. You've brought us peace tonight. Thank you for doing that. And it is a beautiful. I mean, it is an Islamic greeting, is it not? And a way to send people away on their journey. I don't know. I'll leave it to you to utter that to the rest of us, if I may.
Yes, it says wa alaikum assalam, which means that also peace be on you also. Wa is also to you.
Right.
So Muslim greeting is a sort of a prayer for every day. Whenever you see each other, you pray for peace to be with you. And the word Muslim actually means somebody who's at peace and has submitted to the will of God.
How beautiful. What a great note to end on, and a wonderful intention and aspiration. Thank you, Alim. Thank you so much
Thank you
for,
so much,
for being
Frankie.
here this evening. Okay. Thank you, everybody, as well, for taking part. And we'll be back again in a fortnight's time with a similarly open hearted, open minded discussion. Peace be upon you. Take care and bye for now. Adios.